I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The early summer air in the village of Upper Loxley was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the gentle thrum of polite conversation. It was the annual fundraising fete at the historic Holiday Lodge, a grand old house that had recently been converted into a series of luxury holiday apartments, much to the quiet consternation of some of the village's more traditional residents. Lady Amelia Ashworth, the lodge's new, impeccably coiffed owner, glided amongst her guests, a vision in lemon yellow, her laughter tinkling like the delicate crystal flutes from which champagne was being served. Amongst the throng, a small, elderly woman in a sensible tweed skirt and a somewhat unfashionable hat observed the proceedings with an almost imperceptible keenness. This was Miss Jane Marple, a long-time resident of St. Mary Mead, visiting her niece, Mrs. Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, in the neighbouring parish. Griselda, with her usual effervescent energy, had dragged her aunt along, insisting the fete was just the thing to get you out, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple, however, found herself quite content to simply watch, her needles clicking softly on a piece of intricate lace as she took a seat near a particularly vibrant display of petunias. She noted the forced smiles, the subtle snubs, the barely concealed envy in the eyes of some of the local ladies as they admired Lady Ashworth's latest acquisition, a diamond brooch that glittered rather ostentatiously on her silk lapel. The feet were in full swing. Children chased each other across the manicured lawns, their shrill cries momentarily masking the murmur of adult voices. A jazz quartet played a lively, if slightly off-key rendition of a popular tune. Mr. Ponsonby, the retired solicitor, was holding forth to a captive audience about the intricacies of local planning permission, while Mrs. Bantry, a formidable woman with a reputation for knowing everyone's business, was deep in conversation with a flushed-looking young man, Rupert Davies, who had recently moved into one of the newly renovated lodges. He seemed rather too keen to impress, Miss Marple observed, noting the way his eyes kept darting towards Lady Ashworth. Suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the gentle hubbub, silencing the jazz quartet mid-note and freezing the children in their tracks. It came from the direction of the old clock tower, a charming but somewhat dilapidated folly on the edge of the lodge grounds, now part of the experience for the holiday-makers. A hush descended, so profound that the buzzing of a bumblebee could be heard. People turned, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The scream was followed by another choked cry, and then a heavy, sickening thud. Lady Ashworth, who had been laughing a moment before, dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering on the gravel path. A small group, led by the perpetually flustered Reverend Clement, began to move hesitantly towards the clock tower. Miss Marple, though outwardly calm, felt a familiar prickle of unease. It was the sort of sound that spoke of more than just an accident. Within minutes, the awful truth rippled through the stunned crowd. It was Mrs. Caroline Finch, one of Lady Ashworth's newly appointed lodge managers, and a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper business acumen. She lay crumpled at the base of the clock tower, a grotesque tableau against the cheerful summer flowers. A heavy antique telescope, usually kept in the tower's viewing platform, lay beside her, its brass casing dented and smeared. Her neck was at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was spreading slowly across the pristine white of her linen dress. The fete, once a picture of idyllic English summer, had become a scene of unspeakable tragedy, a murder most foul, in the very heart of Upper Loxley. And Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and even keener mind, had already begun to notice the small telling details that others would undoubtedly miss. By the time the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the manicured lawns of Holiday Lodge, the festive atmosphere of the morning had been entirely replaced by a cold clinical efficiency. Inspector Slack, a man who possessed a remarkable talent for being both hurried and ineffective, had arrived from the nearby town with a flurry of notebooks and a sharp, authoritative manner that seemed to irritate everyone involved. The jazz quartet had packed their instruments in a somber silence, and the once vibrant flower stalls now looked like neglected offerings at a funeral. Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting needles stilled, her eyes following the movements of the villagers as they huddled in small, whispering groups. To an outsider, she appeared merely a frail old lady overcome by the shock, but her mind was actively cataloguing the reactions of those around her. Human nature, she often reflected, was very much like a village garden. One had to look beneath the pretty blooms to find the weeds and the slugs. The reaction of the village was a predictable mixture of genuine horror and a rather unseemly relish for drama. Mrs. Bantry was already deep in discussion with the local doctor's wife, her voice a low, urgent hum. She was convinced that a prowler must have climbed the clock tower, a desperate man looking for Lady Ashworth's diamonds, interrupted by the unfortunate Mrs. Finch. It was a theory that gained quick traction among the elderly ladies, who began to look nervously toward the surrounding woods. Meanwhile, Rupert Davies, the young man Miss Marple had noticed earlier, stood apart from the others, his face an ashen mask. He was nervously twisting a signet ring on his finger, his eyes fixed on the tower with an expression that looked more like terror than simple grief. Miss Marple noted that he did not join the speculation. He seemed instead to be desperately trying to avoid being seen. In another corner of the lawn, Mr. Ponsonby was consoling Lady Amelia Ashworth. Her lemon-yellow silk was now incongruously bright against the grim reality of the scene. "It's simply devastating," she sobbed, though Miss Marple couldn't help but notice that her eyes were remarkably dry and darted frequently toward Inspector Slack. Poor dear Caroline. She was so devoted to the lodge. Who could have wanted to hurt her? She was a saint, a positive saint. This statement caused a flicker of a reaction from the village postmistress, Miss Weatherby, who let out a sharp, involuntary sniff. Mrs. Finch, as everyone in Upper Loxley knew, had been anything but a saint. She had been a woman who enjoyed her power, often lauding her position as manager over the local staff and making it quite clear that she considered the village folk to be beneath her. The whispers began to shift. The prowler theory was slowly being replaced by something more intimate, more resentful. "She had a way of rubbing people the wrong way, you know," Miss Weatherby whispered to anyone within earshot, her eyes glinting with the thrill of being the first to cast a stone. "Only last week I heard her threatening young Arthur, the gardener's boy, with dismissal because he'd missed a patch of weeds behind the stables. And the way she spoke to the maid, Mary, well, it was enough to make your blood boil." The suggestion of a local grievance hung in the air thick and heavy. Villagers started looking at each other. Was it possible that one of their own had finally snapped? The idea was terrifying and intoxicating. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous thing, often containing a grain of truth buried under a mountain of exaggeration. She watched as the inspector dismissed the crowd, instructing them to stay within the village for further questioning. As the sun dipped lower, casting long skeletal shadows across the gravel, Miss Marple finally stood up, smoothing her tweed skirt. She watched as Rupert Davies finally broke his frozen stance and hurried away toward the apartments, his gait uneven. She also noticed Lady Ashworth exchange a brief, intense look with Mr. Ponsonby, a look that held a certain level of mutual understanding that went far beyond mere legal counsel. There was a lot of undercurrent in Upper Loxley, she thought. It reminded her of the time the churchwarden's wife had lost her temper over the harvest festival decorations. People were often killed for the most trivial of reasons when their pride or their secrets were at stake. The telescope at the base of the tower was particularly interesting to her. It was a heavy object, not something that would easily fall by accident. As she began her slow walk back toward the vicarage, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of a theory, though it was still as fragile as the lace in her handbag. The village was reacting exactly as she expected, but the truth, she suspected, lay not in the loud theories of the crowd, but in the quiet, desperate silences of the few. The following morning, a deceptive tranquility returned to the grounds of Holiday Lodge, though the yellow police tape fluttering against the weathered stone of the clock tower served as a grim reminder of the previous day's tragedy. Inspector Slack had spent the early hours stomping through the flower beds, his face a permanent shade of frustrated crimson as he barked orders at a weary-looking constable. He had already decided that the case was a straightforward matter of a botched robbery or a sudden fit of pique by a disgruntled employee. To Slack, the world was a place of obvious motives and clumsy fingerprints. He had little patience for the nuances of character that Miss Marple found so illuminating. Jane Marple herself arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, carrying a small basket of wool and a thermos of tea, looking for all the world like a confused elderly relative who had wandered onto the scene by mistake. She found a comfortable spot on a stone wall that offered a clear view of both the clock tower and the side entrance to the main lodge. From this vantage point, she watched the coming and going of the household with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a particularly complex ant hill. She saw Mary, the young housemaid Miss Weatherby had mentioned, emerging to hang some linens. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands shook so violently that she dropped a clothespin twice. It wasn't just grief, Miss Marple noted. It was a profound, shivering apprehension. When Inspector Slack walked past, the girl practically recoiled into the shadows of the doorway. It reminded Miss Marple of young Ethel from St. Mary Mead, who had once hidden a broken Ming vase for 3 weeks out of sheer paralyzed terror of her employer's temper. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple noticed several other patterns that the police ignored in their search for muddy footprints. She watched Mr. Ponsonby, the solicitor, arrive in his sleek black car. Instead of going straight to Lady Ashworth, he spent several minutes pacing the perimeter of the rose garden, his head bowed in deep thought. He stopped once to look up at the clock tower, his expression unreadable, before smoothing his hair and adopting a mask of professional sympathy. Then there was Rupert Davies, who appeared on his balcony with a cigarette. He didn't smoke it, he simply let it burn down to his fingers, staring fixedly at the spot where Caroline Finch had fallen. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like a man waiting for a blow to land. He was a holiday-maker, a stranger to the village, yet he seemed more haunted by the death than those who had known the woman for years. Miss Marple's attention was eventually drawn to the gardener, a burly man named Amiss, who was ostensibly trimming the hedges near her wall. She struck up a conversation with the practiced ease of one who is frequently underestimated. They spoke of the soil, the peculiar acidity of the local peat, and the tragedy of the blight affecting the roses. Slowly she steered the conversation toward the deceased. Amiss spat on the ground, his face hardening. He told her that Mrs. Finch had been a meddler, always poking her nose into the accounts and demanding to know why the mulch cost so much. He mentioned that she had been seen arguing with a tall, dark stranger near the stables 2 nights before the feast. Amiss didn't know who the man was, but he described the encounter as furious. Mrs. Finch had been shouting about a contract and fair shares, while the man had remained ominously silent. This snippet of information was tucked away in Miss Marple's mental filing cabinet, right next to the memory of the village grocer who had been caught skimming the books in 1922. While Slack was busy measuring the height of the tower's parapet, Miss Marple was considering the implications of fair shares. It suggested a partnership or perhaps a predatory arrangement. She watched as Lady Ashworth finally appeared on the terrace, draped in elegant black mourning weeds that looked a touch too fashionable for genuine heartbreak. Lady Ashworth began to direct the servants with a sharp, clear voice, seemingly recovered from her hysterics of the previous day. She paused once to whisper something to Mr. Ponsonby, who nodded gravely and patted her hand. It was a gesture of intimacy that seemed practiced, a silent communication between 2 people who shared more than just a legal bond. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising in the crisp morning air. She thought about the heavy telescope. It was a curious weapon, if indeed it was a weapon. It was an object of precision, used for looking at things far away, yet it had been used to end a life at the closest of quarters. Most importantly, she recalled the exact position of the body. Mrs. Finch had not fallen like someone who had been pushed in a struggle. She had fallen like someone who had been struck while looking at something else. The lack of defensive wounds on her hands, which the doctor had mentioned in passing to the vicar, was highly significant. It suggested she hadn't seen the blow coming. Miss Marple sighed, her knitting needles beginning their rhythmic click-clack once more. The pieces were starting to move, though the board was still obscured by the fog of village gossip and the inspector's blundering certainty. She knew that, to find the truth, she would have to look not at the tower, but at the shadows people cast when they thought no one was watching. By the afternoon of the second day, Inspector Slack believed he had found his man. The atmosphere in Upper Loxley shifted from generalized dread to a focused, sharp-edged hostility directed toward the most convenient target available. Rupert Davies, the young man who had occupied one of the luxury holiday apartments for less than a month, had been taken to the local station for what Slack called routine clarification. However, the speed with which the inspector moved suggested he was eager to wrap the matter up before the weekend. The evidence against Davies was, on the surface, quite compelling. A search of his room had revealed a crumpled note from the deceased, Caroline Finch, requesting a private meeting at the clock tower on the afternoon of the fete to discuss outstanding financial discrepancies. Furthermore, a witness had claimed to see a man fitting Rupert's description descending the tower stairs only minutes before the body was discovered. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with Griselda, who was indignantly defending the young man's character. Griselda argued that Rupert was far too charming and well-mannered to be a murderer, a sentiment that made Miss Marple smile thinly. She remembered a very charming young man in St. Mary Mead who had poisoned 3 of his aunts for their silver collections. Charm, she knew, was often the best cloak for a cold heart. However, her doubt regarding Rupert's guilt did not stem from his manners, but rather from the sheer obviousness of the trail leading to him. It was all a bit too tidy, like a shop window display designed to catch the eye of a hurried passer-by. Slack was a man who loved a tidy display. He had already constructed a narrative where Rupert, a man of mystery with no visible means of support, was being blackmailed by the efficient Mrs. Finch and had struck her down in a panic. "It is so very easy to see what one expects to see, dear Griselda," Miss Marple murmured, her needles working through a row of pearl. "Inspector Slack sees a suspicious stranger, so he finds suspicious evidence, but one must ask why a man as nervous as Mr. Davies would leave such a damning note in his wastepaper basket. It's like leaving the garden gate open when you're trying to keep the fox out. It simply doesn't fit the temperament." She had observed Rupert carefully. He was a man of high-strung, almost feline anxiety. Such men do not usually leave paper trails. They are the types who burn letters and check locks 3 times. The note, she suspected, had been intended to be found, which changed the entire complexion of the crime. If Rupert were being framed, the killer was someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's business and the newcomer's vulnerabilities. While the village celebrated the efficient work of the police, Miss Marple decided to take a turn through the lodge grounds once more. She encountered Mary, the housemaid, near the laundry lines again. The girl was even more distressed than before, her eyes darting toward the inspector's car parked by the main entrance. Miss Marple engaged her in a conversation about the best way to remove grass stains from linen, a topic that eventually led to the girl breaking down in quiet, muffled sobs. Mary confessed that she had seen Mrs. Finch arguing not just with the dark stranger the gardener mentioned, but also with Lady Ashworth herself. It had happened in the library the day before the murder. Mrs. Finch had been threatening to go to the authorities about the true state of the lodge's finances. Mary hadn't understood the details, but she remembered the look on Lady Ashworth's face, a look of cold, calculating fury that had vanished the moment a servant entered the room. This revelation was far more interesting to Miss Marple than a crumpled note in a wastebasket. It placed the motif squarely within the walls of the lodge. If the luxury renovation was a facade for financial ruin, Caroline Finch, the meticulous manager, would have been the first to know, and if she were the type of woman to use that information for her own gain, which her reputation for ruthlessness suggested, she would have been a significant threat to Lady Ashworth's social and financial standing. Miss Marple also noted that Mr. Ponsonby, the solicitor, was the one who had discovered the note in Rupert's room while assisting the police with their search. A solicitor who finds evidence is a solicitor who is directing the light away from his own clients. It was a classic misdirection, reminiscent of the time the local postman had blamed a stray dog for the disappearance of several registered letters, only for Miss Marple to find them tucked inside his own oversized galoshes. As she walked back toward the village, Miss Marple saw Lady Ashworth standing on her terrace, looking out over her estate with the regal air of a queen who had just survived a coup. There was no sign of the grieving employer now. Beside her stood Ponsonby, his hand resting familiarly on her shoulder. They looked like a couple who had successfully navigated a difficult crossing. The inspector might have his suspect, but Miss Marple knew that the real story was hidden in the books that Mrs. Finch had been so keen to audit. The obvious suspect was merely a pawn on the board, and the real player was someone who understood that the best way to hide a leaf is in a forest, or a murder in the middle of a crowded village fete. She needed to find that one small discordant detail that would shatter their carefully constructed illusion. The sun had begun to bake the gravel paths of the holiday lodge with a relentless dry heat that seemed to draw the very moisture from the air. While Inspector Slack was triumphantly supervising the official transport of Rupert Davies to the county seat, Miss Marple returned to the base of the clock tower. She did not look at the heavy telescope, which had already been dusted for prints and whisked away as Exhibit A. Instead, she knelt with a surprising agility for her years, her pale blue eyes scanning the short, scorched grass near the heavy oak door of the Folly. The police had looked for large things, struggles, bloodstains, weapons, but Miss Marple was looking for something that shouldn't be there at all. Her patience was rewarded when she spotted a tiny translucent sliver of something caught in the crevice between two paving stones. With the aid of a small pair of tweezers she kept in her knitting bag, she retrieved the object. It was a fragment of a very thin, high-quality photographic negative, no larger than a fingernail. It had been cleanly cut, as if by a pair of sharp embroidery scissors. Miss Marple held it up to the light, her brow furrowing. It was too small to make out a clear image, but she could see the distinct edge of a typed document. This was a peculiar thing to find at the base of a clock tower, where a woman had supposedly been bludgeoned by a falling telescope. It suggested that someone had been destroying evidence not by burning it, which creates noticeable smoke, but by meticulously cutting it into pieces. And if they were cutting negatives, they were destroying the means to produce more copies of a specific photograph. Miss Marple's mind immediately went back to the financial discrepancies mentioned in the note found in Rupert's room. In her experience, financial ruin in a village like Upper Loxley usually involved one of two things: gambling or living beyond one's means to maintain a social facade. Lady Ashworth's lemon-yellow silk and diamond brooch were expensive, but were they truly affordable? She recalled a similar situation involving the local doctor in St. Mary Mead, who had been secretly selling his patients' private histories to a tabloid journalist to pay off his brother's debts. People often assumed that murder was committed for a sudden, large sum of money, but Miss Marple knew it was more often committed to prevent the loss of what little dignity one had left. The fragment of the negative suggested a much more sophisticated level of planning than a panicked push or a random strike. She moved away from the tower and toward the lodge's kitchen gardens, where she found young Mary sitting on a wooden crate, peeling potatoes with a dull knife. The girl looked haunted, her eyes darting toward the main house every few seconds. Miss Marple sat beside her, offering a peppermint from her pocket. "It's a very heavy telescope, isn't it, dear?" she remarked conversationally. "I remember my father had one. It required a very sturdy tripod to stay level. If it were to fall, it would have to be tilted quite far over the edge. Mary nodded slowly, her voice a mere whisper. Mrs. Finch was always adjusting it, ma'am. She said she liked to watch the birds over by the stables. But there aren't many birds over there. Just the old carriage house where Mr. Ponsonby keeps his extra files. The mention of the carriage house sent a thrill of clarity through Miss Marple. The stables were some distance from the main lodge, secluded and quiet. If Mrs. Finch had been using the telescope not for astronomy but for surveillance, she could have seen exactly who was visiting whom at odd hours. She could have seen the tall, dark stranger the gardener mentioned, or perhaps she had seen something even more damaging. Miss Marple realized that the telescope hadn't fallen on Mrs. Finch. It had been the very reason she was at the tower. She had been watching, and someone had known she was watching. The killer hadn't just used the telescope as a weapon, they had used it to lure her into a position where she was vulnerable, her back turned to the door, her eye pressed to the lens. As she walked back toward the vicarage, Miss Marple felt the weight of the tiny plastic fragment in her pocket. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the one that Inspector Slack would dismiss as mere litter. It linked the murder not to the impulsive actions of a young man like Rupert Davies, but to a calculated effort to suppress a secret that was literally being caught on film. The village gossip about Mrs. Finch's sharp tongue was only half the truth. It was her sharp eyes that had been her undoing. Miss Marple thought of the way Lady Ashworth had dropped her champagne glass at the sound of shouting. Had it been a genuine shock, or a well-timed performance to ensure witnesses surrounded her at the exact moment the deed was done? The Holiday Lodge secret was no longer just about money, it was about the lengths to which a person would go to keep the lens from focusing on the truth. The tension within the drawing-room of Holiday Lodge that evening was as palpable as the humidity before a summer storm. With Rupert Davies safely under lock and key, the local residents felt a strange liberty to speak more freely. Yet the atmosphere was far from relieved. Miss Marple had been invited to tea by Lady Ashworth, a gesture the elderly lady recognized as a tactical move to gauge how much the vicar's aunt had observed. Mr. Ponsonby was also present, standing by the mantelpiece with a glass of sherry, looking every inch the pillars of stability Lady Ashworth required. However, the veneer of aristocratic calm was beginning to crack. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands busy with a new piece of knitting, listening as the conversation turned toward the inevitable topic of the deceased manager. "It is a tragedy, of course," Ponsonby remarked, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth, "but one must admit that Caroline was increasingly erratic. She had developed a rather unhealthy obsession with guests' privacy. I believe she was suffering from a sort of paranoid delusion regarding the lodge's security." Lady Ashworth nodded in agreement, her lemon-yellow silk replaced by a gown of sombre mauve. "Quite right, Arthur. She was constantly making accusations. She even had the audacity to suggest that the renovations were being funded by less than reputable means. It was quite exhausting." Miss Marple noticed a subtle tightening in the muscles of Lady Ashworth's jaw as she spoke. It was the look of a woman who had rehearsed a lie so many times she had almost begun to believe it herself. Miss Marple coughed gently, a sound so small it barely registered. "It is curious," she began, her tone innocent and slightly wavering, "how often a person's delusions turn out to be based on a very inconvenient truth. I remember a similar case in St. Mary Mead. Poor Mr. Gregson. Everyone thought he was quite mad for claiming the postman was stealing his correspondence, until it was discovered the postman was actually his long-lost son-in-law seeking revenge for a disinheritance. Sometimes the people we think are paranoid are simply the only ones paying attention." Ponsonby's grip on his sherry glass tightened, but he managed a strained smile. Lady Ashworth, however, looked like she had been pricked by a needle. She quickly changed the subject, inquiring about the vicar's health, but the seed of unease had been planted. Later that hour, as Miss Marple made her way toward the exit, she encountered the gardener, Amiss, behind the stables. He was no longer trimming hedges, but was instead engaged in a heated, low-voiced argument with the dark stranger he had mentioned earlier. As Miss Marple approached, the stranger turned to leave, and she caught a glimpse of his face. He was older than she had expected, with the weathered, weary look of a man who had seen too much of the world's darker corners. When he had disappeared into the woods, Amos turned to her, his face flushed with anger. "He wants his due, ma'am," Amos spat, forgetting his usual deference. "He says the lodge belongs to his family, not to some high and mighty lady with a fake title. He's been providing the capital for the repairs, and now that the saintly Mrs. Finch is gone, he's afraid his investment has vanished into thin air." This revelation added a significant layer to the mystery. It wasn't just about financial mismanagement. It was about a hidden ownership and perhaps a fraudulent claim to the estate itself. If Lady Ashworth was not the true owner, or if she were merely a front for this silent partner, the stakes were much higher than a few misplaced pounds. Miss Marple realized that Caroline Finch must have discovered the truth about the tall stranger and the source of the lodge's funding. The photographic negative fragment she had found earlier likely depicted the very contract Amos had alluded to, a document that would prove Lady Ashworth was a tenant of her own pride. The confrontation between the villagers' perceived reality and the burgeoning truth was reaching a boiling point. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Bantry arguing with the postmistress outside the lodge gates, their voices rising over the shameful behaviour of the newcomers. Everyone had a secret they were trying to protect. Mary had her fear, Rupert had his past, Ponsonby had his professional reputation, and Lady Ashworth had her entire identity. As she walked back to the vicarage under a darkening sky, Miss Marple felt the weight of these secrets pressing down on the village. The Caroline Finch murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was the inevitable result of a house built on the shifting sands of deception. The telescope had indeed been used to see too much, and the price of that vision had been death. The following morning brought a development that threatened to upend Inspector Slack's tidy resolution of the case. Just as the village was settling into the comfortable belief that Rupert Davies would soon be facing a jury, a discovery was made in the very heart of the village that shifted the shadow of suspicion. The local postman, on his early rounds, found the Holiday Lodge library in a state of absolute chaos. More importantly, he found Mr. Ponsonby, the solicitor, slumped over the mahogany desk, unconscious but fortunately still breathing. A heavy silver inkwell lay on the floor, its contents staining the Persian rug like a pool of congealed blood. The safe behind the portrait of the first Earl of Locksley stood wide open, its contents apparently ransacked. When Miss Marple arrived, having heard the news from a breathless Griselda, the scene was one of frantic activity. Inspector Slack was pacing the room, his face a mask of pure exasperation. "It makes no sense," he barked at the air. "Davies is under lock and key. Unless he has an accomplice, we've got a second criminal on our hands." He looked at Miss Marple as if her presence were a personal insult to his professional dignity. She, however, was not looking at the safe or the unconscious solicitor. Her gaze was fixed on a small rectangular patch of dust on the third shelf of the bookcase, where a specific volume appeared to be missing. It was a shelf dedicated to local history and land registries, a dry subject that would hardly interest a common thief looking for jewels or cash. As the village doctor attended to Ponsonby, who was beginning to moan and clutch his head, the story began to emerge. Lady Ashworth, appearing more frail than usual in a dressing gown of charcoal lace, claimed she had heard a disturbance in the middle of the night, but had been too terrified to investigate. She suggested that perhaps Rupert Davies had not acted alone, that there was a gang targeting the lodge. This theory was immediately embraced by the more excitable elements of the village. It allowed them to maintain their prejudice against the stranger while explaining away the new violence. Yet Miss Marple noticed that despite the ransacked safe, Lady Ashworth was still wearing her diamond brooch. It seemed a very peculiar thief who would ignore a fortune in diamonds on a nightstand to rummage through old legal papers. Miss Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles silent for once. She watched Ponsonby as he regained consciousness. His first instinct was not to ask about his health, but to reach for his briefcase, which was still clutched tightly in his left hand. He seemed immensely relieved to find it undisturbed. This small movement spoke volumes to Miss Marple. It reminded her of old Mr. Benchley in St. Mary Mead, who had once set fire to his own curtains just so he could rescue his mistress's letters in the ensuing confusion without his wife suspecting their existence. The burglary felt staged, a frantic attempt to hide the disappearance of something far more valuable than gold. If the negative fragments she had found earlier represented a threat, then the documents in this room were the substance of that threat. The investigation twist served as a perfect smokescreen. While Slack began a futile search for accomplices and mysterious intruders, the real deception was being reinforced. The killer was using the chaos to destroy the trail that Caroline Finch had been following. Miss Marple realized that the burglary wasn't just a crime, it was a distraction designed to justify the disappearance of the lodge's true financial records. If the records were stolen, they could never be audited. She watched Lady Ashworth and Ponsonby share a look of profound secret understanding. It was no longer a matter of a single murder, it was a systematic dismantling of the truth. The Holiday Lodge secret was being buried under a fresh layer of staged drama, and the village was swallowing the story whole. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll toward the carriage house where Ponsonby kept his extra files. She noticed the lock had recently been oiled. It was a small detail, but in a village where everything was allowed to rust into a state of picturesque decay, an oiled lock was a flashing signal. She thought of the tall, dark stranger and the gardener's mention of fair shares. If there was a partner who felt cheated, he would be the logical choice for a scapegoat. The killer was playing a very clever game, providing the police with a new set of clues that pointed away from the drawing room and toward the woods. But as she watched a hawk circling above the clock tower, Miss Marple knew that the bird of prey never looks at the horizon. It looks directly down at the hidden movement in the grass. The truth was not in the burglary, but in why the burglary had been necessary at all. The afternoon sun cast long amber-toned shadows across the terrace of Holiday Lodge as Miss Marple sat once more with Lady Ashworth. The tea service was laid out with exquisite precision, but the usual village pleasantries felt strained, like a piano slightly out of tune. Miss Marple had requested this private audience under the guise of offering her condolences for the dreadful burglary, yet her true intent was far more surgical. She knew that a person who has committed a crime and successfully diverted suspicion often becomes overconfident, and it is in that moment of perceived safety that the mask is most likely to slip. She adjusted her lace shawl and looked out toward the clock tower, which stood like a silent sentinel over the garden. "It is such a relief that Mr. Ponsonby is recovering," Miss Marple began, her voice a gentle rhythmic warble. "A blow to the head is a treacherous thing. I remember poor Mr. Abernathy back in St. Mary Mead. He was struck by a falling branch, or so he claimed, but he was never quite the same afterward. He started talking about things he should have kept quiet, secrets from 40 years ago. It's funny, Lady Ashworth, how a shock to the system can loosen the tongue. One loses the ability to distinguish between what is real and what we have merely invented to keep ourselves comfortable." She watched Lady Ashworth's hand as it hovered over the sugar tongs. There was a microscopic tremor, a hesitation that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it was there. Lady Ashworth forced a brittle laugh, her eyes remaining cold. "I'm sure Arthur has no such secrets to spill, Jane. He is the soul of discretion. As for the burglary, it was clearly the work of a desperate man, perhaps a confederate of that unfortunate Mr. Davies." She took a sip of tea, her movements practised and elegant. Miss Marple, however, did not let the subject drop. She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of grandmotherly concern. "Perhaps, but it is the missing book that puzzles me. A history of local land tenures seems such an odd prize for a common thief. It reminds me of the time the churchwarden's daughter hid the marriage registry. She didn't want anyone to see the dates, you see. People only steal what they are afraid for others to read. Miss Marple then reached into her handbag and withdrew a small white envelope. She didn't open it, she simply laid it on the table between them. I found something rather curious near the tower yesterday, a fragment of a photographic negative. It's quite ruined, of course, but it clearly showed part of a signature. It looked remarkably like your late husband's hand, Lady Ashworth, or perhaps a very clever imitation of it. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Birds in nearby hedgerows seemed to stop their chirping. Miss Marple watched Lady Ashworth's face intently. The colour did not drain from it. Instead, a hard, porcelain-like stillness took over. It was the reaction of a woman who was calculating the cost of her next move. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Lady Ashworth said, her voice dropping an octave, "and I find your insinuations quite extraordinary for a guest." She reached for the envelope, but Miss Marple's hand remained lightly on top of it. "Oh, I'm not insinuating anything, my dear. I am merely observing, just as Mrs. Finch observed. She was a very observant woman, wasn't she? Perhaps too observant for her own safety. It's a dangerous habit, looking through telescopes. One might see a document being signed that shouldn't exist, or a guest arriving who has no right to be here. Or perhaps," Miss Marple added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "one might see that the person running the lodge is not a lady at all, but someone with much more theatrical background." The psychological bait was taken. Lady Ashworth stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the stone flags. For a fleeting second, the refined facade vanished, replaced by a look of raw, predatory calculation. It was the look of a woman who had fought her way up from the gutter and would kill to stay out of it. "You are an imaginative old woman, Jane Marple," she hissed, "and you would do well to stick to your knitting." She turned and swept into the house without a backward glance. Miss Marple remained seated, calmly picking up her knitting. She had seen what she needed. The reaction wasn't one of innocence or even of simple indignation. It was the defensive strike of a cornered animal. The lady had revealed the actress, and the actress had revealed the killer. As Miss Marple watched her go, she felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for Caroline Finch, who had tried to play a game of blackmail with a woman who had far more to lose. The trap was now set, but it required one final piece of evidence to bring the whole structure down. She knew that Ponsonby and Lady Ashworth would now be forced to move quickly to eliminate the threat she posed, and in their haste they would make the one mistake that even the cleverest criminal cannot avoid. She tucked the empty envelope back into her bag, for it had indeed been empty, a simple bluff to see if the guilty conscience would fill in the blanks. The game was reaching its conclusion, and the peace of Upper Loxley was about to be shattered by the truth. The gathering in the library of Holiday Lodge that evening was not a social affair, despite the presence of decanters and fine crystal. Inspector Slack stood by the window, his arms folded across his chest, looking remarkably petulant. He had been forced to release Rupert Davies after a frantic telephone call from London confirmed the young man was a highly respected, albeit eccentric, investigative journalist looking into offshore property scams. The inspector's tidy case had evaporated, leaving him in a foul temper. Lady Ashworth sat in her high-backed chair, her face a mask of regal indifference, while Mr. Ponsonby stood behind her, a bandage still prominently displayed on his forehead. Miss Marple sat in the centre of the room, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, rhythmic cadence that seemed to grate on everyone's nerves. "I believe we are all here because of a very unfortunate misunderstanding," Lady Ashworth began, her voice dripping with practised condescension. "Miss Marple has some rather imaginative theories she wishes to share before she returns to St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes clear and remarkably sharp. "It is not imagination, my dear, but a simple matter of observing human nature. In a village, one learns that people rarely change their spots. When I first arrived, I was struck by how much this situation reminded me of old Mrs. Partridge's poultry farm. She had a fox in the hen house, but she was so busy blaming the neighbour's dog that she never noticed. The fox was wearing a very convincing collar. She paused, her needle stilled. You, Lady Ashworth, or should I say, Miss Amelia Vance of the Gaiety Theatre, are a very convincing fox. The silence that followed was absolute. Ponsonby started to speak, but Miss Marple held up a delicate hand. Please, Mr. Ponsonby, the burglary was a clever touch, but a man of your experience should know that a real thief doesn't leave the most valuable jewels on the nightstand while he searches for dry land registries. You struck yourself with that inkwell, a very brave act, though I suspect you checked the weight of the silver first. The goal was to make it appear that an intruder stole the documents Caroline Finch had discovered, but those documents never left this house. They were already destroyed, cut into tiny pieces with embroidery scissors. I found a fragment of a negative near the tower, you see. It wasn't a land registry, it was a marriage certificate. One that proved the real Lady Ashworth died in a sanitarium in Switzerland 5 years ago, and her companion, a struggling actress, simply stepped into her life. Inspector Slack moved forward, his mouth agape, but Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. Caroline Finch was a meticulous manager. She realized the finances didn't add up because the lodge was being used to launder the theatrical investments of your silent partner, the man the gardener saw. When she looked through that telescope, she wasn't looking at birds. She was looking at the carriage house, where she saw you, Mr. Ponsonby, handing over the forged deeds to that same man. She tried to blackmail you, didn't she? A very dangerous game to play with two people who have spent 5 years building a fortress of lies. You couldn't pay her off without revealing the fraud, so she had to be removed. This is preposterous, Ponsonby shouted, his face reddening. There is no proof. Miss Marple smiled sadly. The proof, Mr. Ponsonby, is in the telescope itself. You see, when you struck her, you were in such a hurry to make it look like an accident, a fall from the tower, that you forgot one very small detail. You wiped the brass casing for fingerprints, but you didn't think to check the lens. Mrs. Finch wore a very particular type of heavy theatrical makeup, a habit she kept from her own youth. When she was pressed against that lens, she left a distinct smear of Rose Orient grease paint. I noticed it the first day, but more importantly, the telescope was tilted at an angle that would be impossible for someone of her height to use unless they were standing on a chair. You lured her there, told her there was something she must see, and while she was distracted, you struck her from behind. Lady Ashworth lunged toward Miss Marple, her face contorted with a fury that was entirely unladylike, but Slack's constable was quicker, stepping between them. The lady collapsed back into her chair, the facade finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Ponsonby simply slumped, the weight of the bandage on his head seemingly too much to bear. It was the money, he muttered, his voice hollow. The estate was bankrupt. We only wanted to save it. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. You didn't want to save the estate, Mr. Ponsonby. You wanted to save the lie. It's a common mistake. People will do extraordinary things to keep the world from seeing them as they truly are. But in the end, the truth is like the weeds in my garden. No matter how much gravel you lay over them, they always find a way to the surface. As Slack began the formal process of cautioning the pair, Miss Marple stood up and began to pack away her knitting. The mystery of the holiday lodge was solved, not by forensic science or grand chases, but by a tiny fragment of plastic and a smear of grease paint. She felt a weary sort of satisfaction. She had seen it all before, of course, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Human nature was the same everywhere, whether in a palace or a cottage. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back at the room one last time. The sun had set, and the shadows had finally claimed the library. The secret was out, and the holiday lodge would soon be just another empty house, haunted by the memory of a woman who saw too much and a pair who dared too little. The following morning the village of Upper Loxley awoke to a world that felt strangely altered, as if a thick, distorting mist had finally lifted to reveal a landscape both familiar and unsettling. The news of the arrests had travelled with the speed of a summer gale, leaving a trail of dropped teacups and hushed conversations in its wake. Lady Amelia Ashworth, or rather Amelia Vance, and Mr. Ponsonby had been taken away in the early hours of the dawn, leaving the grand gates of Holiday Lodge swinging aimlessly in the breeze. The police tape still clung to the clock tower, but the sense of immediate, sharp-edged terror had been replaced by a lingering, dull ache of betrayal. The villagers, who had so recently enjoyed the feast and admired the lemon-yellow silk, now found themselves looking at one another with a new, sharper sense of doubt. Miss Marple sat on the terrace of the vicarage, the morning sun warming her hands as she finished the last few rows of her lacework. Griselda sat opposite her, unusually quiet, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the lodge. The scandal had rocked the parish to its core, and even the vicar's wife was finding it difficult to maintain her usual cheerful cynicism. "To think, Aunt Jane," Griselda said softly, "that she was an actress the whole time. Everyone believed in her. She played the part of a lady better than the real thing could have, I suppose. It makes one wonder if anyone is truly who they say they are." Miss Marple paused, her needles catching the light. She thought of all the people she had known in St. Mary Mead who had lived behind carefully maintained hedges and even more carefully maintained reputations. "The world is a very large stage, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle yet firm. "But the problem with acting is that it requires a constant, exhausting effort to suppress the truth. Amelia Vance was a woman of great talent, no doubt, but she lacked the one thing that truly defines a lady, a sense of responsibility toward others. She and Mr. Ponsonby were so consumed with preserving their fiction that they forgot the value of a single human life. To them, Caroline Finch was not a woman with her own hopes or history. She was merely an obstacle, a crack in the scenery that had to be patched over. It is a very dangerous thing when vanity becomes more important than morality. I have seen it happen over a jar of prize-winning jam as often as I have seen it over a grand estate." As they spoke, they saw the dark stranger walking down the lane, carrying a small suitcase. He was the man who had actually held the financial strings, the one who had inadvertently provided the motive for murder. He looked neither triumphant nor vengeful, only weary. He had reclaimed his family's interests, perhaps, but the cost had been a woman's life and a village's peace. Miss Marple watched him pass, her expression one of quiet contemplation. She knew Upper Loxley would eventually return to its routine. The gardens would be tended, the church bells would ring, and the gossip would eventually find a new, less lethal topic. But the air of unease would remain for a long time. The Holiday Lodge secret had left a stain that no amount of village politeness could entirely wash away. Inspector Slack had stopped by earlier to offer a gruff, almost resentful word of thanks. He had been particularly annoyed to find that the Rose Orient grease paint was indeed a documented favourite of the victim, a detail he had dismissed as feminine triviality. He had left in a hurry, eager to return to the comfort of his measurable evidence and his predictable criminals. Miss Marple did not begrudge him his irritation. Men like Slack were necessary for the machinery of justice, but they seldom understood the intricate clockwork of the human heart. They looked for the hand that held the weapon, while Miss Marple looked for the fear that moved the hand. It was a distinction that had served her well through many years of social observation. The afternoon wore on, and the shadows of the apple trees began to stretch across the lawn. Miss Marple folded her lace and tucked it into her bag. Her visit to her niece was coming to an end, and she felt a sudden, sharp longing for the familiar comforts of her own cottage in St. Mary Mead. She missed the predictable eccentricities of her neighbours and the reliable rhythm of her own garden. There was something to be said for a place where secrets were few and tragedies few. Human nature was indeed the same everywhere, but she found that as she grew older, she preferred to observe its darker side from a respectful distance, preferably with a cup of hot tea and a new skein of wool nearby. As she prepared for her departure, Miss Marple took one final look toward the clock tower of Holiday Lodge. It looked quite peaceful now, the brass telescope removed and the window shuttered. The truth had been revealed, the guilty had been caught, and the innocent, or the relatively innocent, had been cleared. Yet she knew that another mystery would eventually present itself, for as long as there were people with something to hide and something to gain, there would be work for a quiet old lady with a keen eye for detail. With a small, resigned sigh, Jane Marple stepped into the vicar's car, her mind already turning toward the autumn planting and the simple, honest beauty of the world she called home.